a Thank you very much, Julia. I will pop our website address in the chat as well, so everybody can check that out. And if you would like to join us or ask any questions later, we are available. If you search for us under there. And with that, I will hand you over to Richard from Highland Carbon, who will be having a really useful conversation today around carbon markets and how we can utilise these to, again, move this kind of whole conversation around sustainability towards kind of regenerative practices as well. So over to you, Richard. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think the share screen, it's saying host participant screen sharing okay. There we go. Sorry, it just takes a moment to load it. So from beginning. So hopefully you can all see this. So just to give you a bit of an introduction, really, I'm mainly talking today about TreeWilder, and TreeWilder is a brand for consumer carbon offsetting through the purchase of carbon credits on a monthly basis. So it's a subscription opportunity through an e-commerce platform. So it's treewilder.com. So this is a website that we've set up through Highland Carbon, really to bring more investment into projects which have a meaningful impact. And I'm going to talk through those kinds of projects and how we go about things through the slides. And then there'll be an opportunity for a conversation at the end. And I very much welcome your input. And as Michelle mentioned, you can put questions into the chat as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end, if that's okay with everybody. So I think there's a slight delay as I... Yeah, there's a slight delay there. Yeah, so when we're looking at climate change, really, there's so many factors and there's so many solutions that are important and are needed. Our focus through our business, Highland Carbon, and specifically our brand, TreeWilder, is around investment in nature-based solutions and renewable energy. And so, in effect, we're stacking those two things together. These two things alone aren't the answer to the climate crisis. Of course, there's a whole range of things that needs to happen. And one of the things I often hear is that there's not enough land on the world to plant enough trees to solve the climate crisis. And that's, of course, true. And we're not proposing that this is the only solution. What we are advocating for is this as part of the solution, alongside major commitments in reduction and major transition by various industries, which we're beginning to see. And even in the sectors that we never thought we'd see, like steel is now moving into renewable energy, steel production, and so on. It's an exciting time. So that's our focus in those areas, and these are the whole range of areas that the UN talks about and the IPCC talk about. So why TreeWilder? Well, with the best will in the world, all of us want to have an impact on the environment and climate, and to reduce the negative impacts. If we lived like monks and did everything possible to reduce our consumption of energy, there would still be a carbon footprint, because every product that we use has a carbon footprint. The way that we live, the way that we travel. Trains, for example, aren't carbon neutral. I know that because I talk to those companies. So we can make reductions, but there's usually something left at the end. So what we're not suggesting is that nature-based solutions are a panacea at all. What we're suggesting is that it's something that can be bolted on to everything else that people do to have a more rounded and full impact for sustainability. Now, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about my journey, and the only reason for doing this is to show that I've been a genuine greenie for the whole of my life. So, from my childhood, growing up watching Jacques Cousteau documentaries and David Attenborough all the way through today. And back, I can tell you in the 80s, it really wasn't cool. It was being an environmentalist was kind of a fringe movement, and we're sort of seen as hippies. And I'd often have conversations with people where they'd say, why do you care about the environment? As if it was some abstract, separate thing. So I'm going to tell you just a bit about my journey so you can see how we got here, how we got to Highland Carbon and then TreeWilder. So in particular here, you'll see I'm with an orangutan. I was working in the primate section of the zoo early on in my career. So this is my working here in the UK. And I worked with the Woodland Trust. I led their team in the corporate partnership section for new business around the time that the trust launched the Woodland Carbon Code. And that's how I came to know about it. I've spent time between the US and the UK throughout my life. That's partly because my family moved out there, my parents divorced, and my mum moved back. So I've been going back and forth between the two. But when I was in university, I was involved with setting up the first Earth Day festival. This is in the early 80s on campus. And myself and a few other people lobbied the university to start recycling, which hadn't been done before. And that was successful. And it was kind of the beginning of that journey. When I was in graduate school, getting my master's degree in zoology, I worked for a recycling charity, and we were involved in setting up the second curbside recycling program in the whole of the US. The first one was set up in Seattle, and we were set up in East Lansing in Michigan. And I've been involved with various other causes throughout my career. The Nature Conservancy is an important one because they are the largest land-based conservation charity in the world in terms of establishing nature reserves and protecting pristine habitats. And that's very much had a big influence on the way that I work and think about things. So the Woodland Trust has had a big influence on me because they're very much involved in afforestation at scale. That is really their key purpose. And I was very much impressed by the work that they did around diverse native tree planting. And I was inspired thinking back a bit to my time at the Nature Conservancy, where everything that we did was science driven. So we thought very carefully about where we undertook projects and how we undertook them. And we looked at the whole landscape conservation context. And then we drilled into particular rare and endangered species. And so when I was working in the Great Lakes region, we were working on conservation for the grey wolf, mountain lions, bears, lynx, all sorts of things, which are sort of relevant to the UK because they used to exist here before Roman times. So it gives us sort of a glimpse into the past. And really bringing those two things together, in 2017, I set up Highland Carbon. And Highland Carbon really as a supplier of climate projects, and in particular starting out supplying ethical businesses who are actively reducing their carbon footprint. So these are businesses in the voluntary market. They're low polluters who are doing the right thing. We've won awards for best UK-wide carbon credit supplier for the last 3 years. And my journey latterly has been to set up TreeWilder for individuals to access the same kind of quality projects that we're developing here in the UK, and also opportunities for global impacts with projects around the world. So I think a really important part of the background to this is how altered the UK landscape is. So the bad news is we have the least forested country in Europe, with the exception of Iceland. And I think we can leave Iceland as an outlier because it's in the Arctic. But if you look at the average forest cover in Europe, it's around 30% plus. And if you look in Scandinavia, it's 60% plus. And certainly the northern part of the UK would have resembled Scandinavia very much. Most of the country would have been forested. We would have, of course, had moorland, wetlands, lakes, heathland, and everything else. But it was mostly a forested landscape in Roman times, if we go back that far. You'll see on the map that there's some areas of the country which have more forest than others. Quite a bit of that is commercial forestry rather than native forestry, diverse native forestry. There's very little of that left in the UK. The good news is that we've gone from 12% forest cover 5 years ago to 13% forest cover. And that might not sound like a lot, but actually it is. That's a huge amount of work. There's a huge amount of projects being set up in the UK to make that change. Allied to this is really a biodiversity collapse. It's obviously a global issue, but here in the UK, we're especially hard hit. we've seen a reduction of around 50% of our biodiversity. If you look at the rarest species, there's some real areas of concern around them. The good news is the species being reintroduced. We're seeing beaver and other species being reintroduced. The white-tailed eagle was an amazing success story, and there's conversations going on now around reintroducing the lynx and some other species. So it's an interesting time, and in a way, if you think of the UK as being almost a blank canvas, we have an exciting opportunity to take it back to what it would have looked like thousands of years ago. So of course, trees are miraculous in terms of locking up greenhouse gas. So they're locking up carbon within their biomass. So that's everything from the trunks, which can be twice the size of what you see above ground. Sorry, the roots, then the trunks, then the branches, and everything else. So they are amazing at vacuuming up CO2 and giving us the oxygen that we need to breathe. And also they offer huge biodiversity benefits. They have microclimate benefits in terms of water movement through the system and also temperature buffering. So they're wonderful things for climate change. I've got a picture here of an area of Glen Affric. So we talked a bit about native forest. If you look at Scotland in particular, which is the area where we mostly focus, we also have projects in Northern England coming into our portfolio. But in Scotland, the Caledonian forest there's only about 1% of native Caledonian forest remaining. And it tends to be in the least accessible places, on islands in lochs, on steep, craggy uplands, and where there's no access lanes. So when you get into the real interior of the Highlands, for example, and it's in those places where you find what would have been going back centuries and millennia. And this is the sort of thing that we're really keen on bringing back, and other native forests appropriate for different parts of the UK. So through Highland Carbon, we partner with a dozen large estates working at scale. And then we bring those projects available to individuals on TreeWilder. An amazing part about this area is the green economy. This is no small thing. So the projects that we've been involved in to date, they bring together private finance and public funding. The private finance element has been around £3 million. The public funding element is around 15 million. If you think about 18 million pounds, which is flowing into the supply chain, that's going into tree nurseries, it's going into ecologists, it's going into ground work, excavator operators, and so on, people putting in access lanes and grading land and prepping land for tree planting. It's going into deer fence construction where needed, and so on. So there's a vast supply chain, and it's really important because these projects are in very remote areas. They're some of the remotest in the UK. In our case, in the center of the Highlands or on the Outer Hebrides, for example. And in these places, there's very little full-time year-round employment. So the human element of the story is a very important one, and it's something that we'll touch on a bit more as I go through these slides. So we're talking about TreeWilder in particular. So this is our website that we've set up for individuals, and it's treewilder.com, TreeWilder being all one word. And as I mentioned, it's a monthly subscription program. And so I'm going to drill into how it works and the sort of things that we do. So if you look at the basic package, which is for a typical household, is for 3 tons a year, and that's £4 a month, which is about the cost of a hot drink on the high street, or a pint maybe a month, for example. So how does that work? So we're supporting a range of projects here in the UK, which are nature-based, and we're supporting nature-based and renewable energy projects around the world. And we bundle those together. So you'll notice this is for 3 tons. As I click through them, these are the international standards that we work with. So everything that we do is through official commodity exchanges, and all of the units are traceable. They can only be assigned and retired to one individual or to one business, as it may be. And they are officially recognized frameworks that they count towards the aims of the Paris Agreement. So it all aligns to the global commitment to addressing the drivers of climate change. The UK targets. So the UK targets, we've got a target for net zero 2050. Scotland is, I believe, net zero 2045. And then you have all of the targets within all of the organizations and agencies below that. So this is where we're all moving. So when you hear activists talking about how are we going to get there, this is it. This is how the UN sees this journey through projects like this, allied with the reductions that we've talked about at the beginning. So this is everything from renewable projects. We support, there's a project called Enercon in India, which is a large wind farm. And this is an important one because it's not only offering renewable energy at scale, but it's offering affordable clean energy also to people. And so we see this as a project of having merit. And this is within the United Nations' own framework, which is called the Clean Development Mechanism. So it has their own hallmark on it. We also support tropical forest conservation projects. And we'll probably talk a bit about this in the questions section because this is a hot topic. And again, this is through recognized frameworks that count towards the official aims of the United Nations. And here's another example, which is a renewable project which we've supported. It's a solar project. The international projects are sourced from around 90 countries, and they are in the developing world. And that's the way the international market is set up for voluntary carbon offsetting. And that's dictated by the terms of the Paris Agreement. So allied to this, you have what we do in country, in the developed world, I should say. So I'm going to talk a bit about the project that we're supporting through these initiatives through TreeWilder in the UK. So we've only supported one project so far, and that is our project at Loch Ness. And this is an exciting project. It's a permanent woodland, and it represents a diverse native planting scheme. So it's putting back the right tree in the right place. And there's, from memory, a dozen tree species on this project site. And it's in a very important area for achieving rewilding to enhance the kind of things that we already have in the landscape, like the Glen Affric project area, which I showed a picture of a moment ago. So we set up Highland Carbon as an ethical supplier. So we were new to the market. In 2017, there were some established other businesses in this space. And what we wanted to do was to disrupt the market. And we wanted to do that in a few key ways. And one of them is that all of our projects are undertaken within a conservation biodiversity framework. That was not the case when we entered the market. In fact, when you look at most of the projects that happen in the UK, that typically involve trees being planted on arable farmland. And a lot of them entail relatively few tree species being planted. Why is that? Because it's cheaper to buy certain species of trees at scale, and therefore the organizations that are, or the businesses that are selling those offsets achieve a bigger margin by doing that. We're not looking for the biggest margin. We're looking for the most authentic projects to be supported. The other important thing is we want to make sure that there's no people cleared off the land to be replaced by forests. So we're working with estates that are so large that they will have farming on areas of the estates. They'll typically have crofters, and they'll have a multi-use of the landscape. So we are returning some of that land to what it would have been like, but not the whole of these estates. They're so vast, it's not feasible in the short term. And this means that the local people can continue to work on these estates. The crofters continue to live there, and they can continue to graze sheep on the land, for example. So it's harmonious with that, with the history. What we don't want to do is to repeat the Highland clearances and to have people taken out of these wild landscapes. I mentioned that everything that we do is official and traceable. What I haven't mentioned is that we have a low commission. We believe it's the lowest commission in this space, which is typically 10% or less. It's between 7 and 10%. It depends a bit on the scale of the projects, how we work. Some of the others in this market, their commission is 20% to 40%. And that's because they're not being transparent with all of their supply chain, whereas we are completely transparent with the landowners we partner with, our forestry business partners, and our buyers. And so why is that important? If an intermediary or a broker is skimming all the money off these projects, and there isn't enough money to invest in their sustainability because these have to be managed over time. The forestry projects, they have a carbon budget, typically over a period of 45 to 65 years, and that's to allow the trees to grow optimally. The optimum rate of growth is typically around year 25. It slows down, there's a bell curve, but you're locking up as much carbon as possible within that growth period for a newly planted woodland. And that's important because existing woodlands don't bring this benefit. Existing woodlands aren't achieving nature additionality and carbon additionality. Rather, they are in stasis with trees continually seeding, growing, and dying and releasing CO2. So it's important that we're supporting new woodland to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And we're doing so at scale with a low commission. These projects are sustainable across the 65 years for woodland projects. I mentioned my background is zoology. So we really think carefully about where to undertake projects, which landowners to engage with, how we design those projects, to think about which species are in the landscape and how they benefit, and how we put back an appropriate woodland for the area of the UK where we're working. So I mentioned that we're involved with diverse tree planting schemes. This is really exciting. It's not monoculture blocks of linear trees. There's a mixture of trees in different sections of each of the project areas, and it's the right tree in the right place. Excuse me a moment. I do apologize. A bit of a cold. And we're also reintroducing trees that have been lost from the landscape. These include, for example, aspen. If you've seen footage of the Rocky Mountains in North America, including, say, Montana, Colorado, Canada, going up to Saskatchewan and so on, you'll see aspen is very much a part of the conifer forests. They have mixed broadleaf species within, and it really is a dramatic look to these woodlands. That's how Scotland would have looked. We had aspen in the landscape, and it's been all but wiped out. There are major efforts to reintroduce it now into wet ground. We're also reintroducing oak into highland locations. This sounds crazy because there's oak in parklands in Britain and within woodlands in England, for example. In the highlands, it's been all but eliminated. So oak trees are being reintroduced and others. So how do we go about it? I will explain what this map means. You can see the small map of Scotland on the left with the dot. That's where our Loch Ness project is located. It's indicated in the larger map with an arrow. You'll see different zones on this map. So this is data from Nature Scot, and it shows the different important habitats within the landscape. And this includes, for example, sites of special scientific interest, which are denoted in the red hashes, special conservation areas, and so on. There's a whole range of these. The green areas are nature reserves, for example. We're keen to enhance what is already there and, in effect, to contribute to the spreading of that quality habitat and to creating buffers that benefit that habitat for wildlife in relation to shelter belts and so on. So as I progress through this, this is a close-up of where our project is taking place at Loch Ness. So you'll see these conservation designations nearby in the landscape. You'll see established woodland already marked out, and you'll see this sort of blank area here, which we are helping to fill in. I think it's important to stress that these projects, the ones that we undertake, they can be from 100 hectares to 300 hectares. In the scale of the whole landscape, they are not enormous, which is why it's so important that we think carefully about where they are so that we can join up what is already there and enhance it. So this area down by the loch that you can see on the left of the slide, there's red squirrels and pine martens in there. We don't know that the Scottish wildcat's in there, but there are Scottish wildcats in the central area of Scotland. So if ourselves and others are working hard to join up each of these pieces of the jigsaw. In time, the native species will have the opportunity to spread out into a larger area. So this is giving kind of an idea of how we think about where we work. So there's an area of Scotland called the Afric Highlands. You'll see on the right side of the map is Loch Ness, and our project is just within the graphic, the dotted line indicated here. And so our small project over here, it's large by UK standards, but in the context of the landscape, it's allied to lots of work that's going on across dozens of estates within this key area. And you could replicate that throughout, other parts of Scotland where there's various different organizations who are concentrating their effort in important areas. And I say important in terms of the rare wildlife that's in those areas, and important in terms of the quality of the habitat that is already there. And these are, nearly pristine vestiges of Caledonian forests in this case. Now, Scotland is becoming famous worldwide for becoming potentially the first rewilding nation. The movement is also gathering steam in England, and there's some amazing projects happening across England, Wales also, and Northern Ireland. But Scotland is really leading the way, and it's leading the way because there's such large areas of land that can be managed and enhanced by working in partnership with landowners. That is hard to replicate in other parts of the UK. And the other reason is because the supply chain is in place up there. And that includes, crucially, vast tree nurseries where they source the seeds from near to the site where the trees are being planted. So even the tree seeds are all traceable. This is exciting. So the bad news, of course, at the beginning was the Caledonian forest has been annihilated. The bald mountains that you see in Scotland and in England and elsewhere are not native habitats. That's not what the UK would look like. But because investment is happening at scale, we can benefit from this nearly blank canvas and do something really exciting and inspirational. And it's getting noticed around the world. And I speak with people from all over the world every week. So these are some of the species that are within the landscape, some of the rare species that I mentioned. And they'll benefit generally from the improvements across a range of different estates. So it would be unfair to say that our project alone is going to save some of these rare species. The whole of the work that's being done in that area, you can say, is going to have a collective impact across this. And so we can take some credit, and so can our supporters in terms of achieving these outcomes. Some of the rare species here. So really, this is one of the most biodiverse parts of the whole of the UK, which is why it's an important area for us to focus, along with our other areas where we also have projects. So I talked a bit about the human impacts being so important, and I've already touched on socioeconomics in this. What I neglected to say perhaps is that often the crofters themselves are working on the projects. So we're involved with projects where crofters are involved with hydrology work in terms of constructing dams and moving rocks for use in access lanes, creating access lanes, operating diggers, putting fences in, and so on. So there are people in these specific places who are benefiting, who are already there, in addition to everyone who comes in from the outside to make these projects happen. In Scotland, the tourism sector is the second biggest sector of the economy. And you can say this for parts of England where we also work, in Northumberland and Cumbria and the Yorkshire Dales and so on. They're major centres of ecotourism. So it's important really to have quality habitats that people will travel to see and to enjoy and to benefit a sustainable economy locally. These projects have a huge impact in terms of water quality. That's true for our forest projects, and it's especially true for our peatland restoration projects. Our peatland projects are essentially reflooding landscapes, and the sphagnum comes back to life, and the sphagnum acts as an enormous filter on the hillside, and it buffers the flow of water into burns and into lochs, and it filters it as well as it goes. So it's having a big impact on water quality for rivers and lochs and drinking water sources. As you can imagine, there's huge benefits for flood mitigation. Essentially, we've taken what you can imagine was a thatched roof and we've turned it into a slate roof when you look at the mountains. So the water just courses off these mountains, and that's one of the reasons why we get flooding, especially downstream. We're very keen to champion public access. One of the reasons that we work significantly in Scotland is because they have default laws in Scotland for public access. So there's right to roam across the whole of Scotland, and there's right to public camping as well. And we're very keen on developing educational opportunities within each of these states where we are working. And I'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Here we go. Yeah, so a number of the states who we work with, they allow local schools to come and visit the new woodlands that are being planted and to learn about the ecology, the impacts in terms of the biodiversity, water quality, and the climate impacts. And so it's really useful for young people and children. And we also proactively support a number of organizations. One of them is called Highlands Outdoor Wilderness Learning. And this is a charity which takes young people from typically deprived urban areas and gives them opportunities to learn about ecology in the remote landscape. And a number of these young people have gone on to achieve jobs within the different estates, within the sort of nature management framework, and the broader nature ranger sort of approach, which is developing now. As Scotland is moving away from just a consumption model of hunting and fishing into one where it's really nature experiences. And another organization we support is called Fuel Change. And that's an organization that supports mentoring of young people within companies and in universities and in the public sector to develop real world sustainability solutions. So this can be, for example, whiskey businesses who are working on how to address their energy challenges as it relates to distillation. Another organization that we are working on partnering with is the University of the Highlands and Islands. We're setting up a sustainable food forest for communities to access. And this is an organic fruit forest alongside one of our wilding projects. So to date, through Highland Carbon, we've planted over 4 million trees. And this in the UK equates to over 1 million tons of sequestration. And we're growing annually. And it's our hope, really, that the development TreeWilder, which is our consumer brand, will help to support this too. And we'll achieve an even bigger outcome. I touched a moment ago on peatland restoration. The before picture of peatlands in the UK is really shocking. So the short story about this is that there were grants from government for landowners to drain land that is wet to convert it to grazing. And over time, these peatland habitats, as they've dried out, they've turned into, in effect, a compost heap where the organic matter is biodegrading and emitting greenhouse gas. And in Scotland, it's the second biggest source of greenhouse gas if you look at it in isolation compared to transport. So this is an exciting new growing area because as soon as these areas are flooded through engineering works and re-wetted, the pH changes and they immediately cease to emit greenhouse gas. And within a month or two, they're bursting with life because the dormant seed within the site comes back to life. Plants naturally recolonize, and you have a whole range of animal species who reestablish very quickly within these habitats. Whereas the damaged sites, you'll see a hag and gully system, sometimes 1 meter to 3 meters high. And in those gullies, sheep can't graze in them. Lambs fall between them, get trapped. And even birds like grouse, the chicks fall into them. They're predated. So they're no use to anybody at this point. So this is a really exciting way that habitat can be rewilded at scale. And this is a big part of what we're doing also through Highland Carbon and TreeWilder. So in summary, really, climate action is in the hands of the public in terms of reducing And we offer one of the ways. There are many organizations like us, but we like to think that we're offering something which is exceptional, to take nature back to what it was, to invest in ethical projects, and to support renewable energy projects that have meaningful impacts. So that is the end of the slides.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard.
You're very welcome. So we may have some questions, and I'll do my best.
I've stuck a couple of questions in there.
Okay.
Because this is, so I put in there about the recent bad press around voluntary carbon markets, because I think it'd be important to touch on that, because I have colleagues who are now very anti carbon credit because of the bad press, but I then also work with other people in Africa who are setting up forestry projects, for example, and they see it as super important to get that flow of capital back towards nature-based solutions. So kind of, can you just have a little chat with us about that, please?
Yeah, so really, these projects do present an opportunity to restore habitat at vast scale. And I'd say in the UK, this is the biggest opportunity we've ever had in the history of the UK. The amount of finance that is available to really transform the landscape at scale is spectacular. You also see investment in the developing world. And where there has been criticism, there was an article, I think it was in the spring of the early spring of this year. There was an article in the Guardian, so I'll explain what that was about. So the article wasn't written by the Guardian; it was written by a consulting firm, and it was published by the Guardian. There's been a lot of discussion about it afterwards, but I'll give you kind of the framework as I understand it. There are various different frameworks out there for carbon offsetting projects. And within any entity who's selling them, like Highland Carbon, we're offering various frameworks. There was one aspect of carbon offsetting which was being criticized, and it was particularly something called the Verified Carbon Standard, which was offered by Verra. So Verra, VERRA, is one organization out of dozens of organizations in this market that was selling a particular product. And that one product was something called the reduction of environmental degradation and deforestation. It's also known as RED Plus. So out of the hundreds of projects that they sell and they're involved with developing around the world, it was one category of project in tropical forests. So it didn't cover all tropical forests. This is an important point. It's a relatively small part of the whole of the carbon market, but it's still important to talk about it. So the criticism that was leveled at the time was one that the projected rate of deforestation within the project area was lower than expected. This is an important point to make because people can wrongly assume that the projects are failing to such an extent that deforestation is spreading into them. It's actually the opposite. So if you look at it philosophically, it was in a way a good news story. So the way that these tropical forest conservation projects work is pulling levers. Each of those levers is a human lever. So we're in effect working in a social science. This is very different from what we're doing in Scotland, where we're planting a forest where there isn't one at all. And it's very easy to measure and quantify the impact of that. We can predict, within tons, how many tons are going to be offset within a particular project. This is more of a social science in places like Brazil, Venezuela, and so on. So the areas of the social science are around education. So it's educating local people about not taking firewood out of jungle areas and not getting involved with clearing land and bushmeat trade and so on. The other lever is enforcement. So it's to do with, governments catching people who are illegally logging in areas like this. The other areas are to do with patrolling, nature rangers, and so on. They're all a social science. So the analogy I would give is the COVID epidemic. When the scientists were trying to predict the rate of spread of COVID, they had to model human behavior, which is difficult to predict. Now, one could say that in the COVID epidemic, they didn't get their modeling perfect. And that's because some people stayed in more and some people went out more at different times of the pandemic. So the analogy here is that each of those levers that were being pulled, as I see it, didn't only have an impact within that project area, they also had a halo effect in the surrounding areas, so that you saw the rate of deforestation decreasing across these areas in general. One of the issues with the article that was published was it had selective reporting in it. And so they selected, I think it was 4 or 5 projects where the deforestation rates didn't add up to what was being projected by Vera. And they did not report on the ones where the projections were correct. The problem is that people seize on, there's a certain psychology to the way that human memory works and how it affects us, how we think about politics. We're triggered by anger. So if we find out that something is upsetting, we will remember that one piece of information and often lose the whole context around it. And so this is something that people have really latched onto and thought about a great deal. Vera themselves are, they've been going through a major consultation with different partners around how they adjust their algorithms for measuring the amount of tonnage that can be extracted in terms of carbon from conservation projects. So they are moving in that direction. I think it'd be a real pity if this one thing took down the whole carbon market, because we wouldn't like to see the future without it, because the carbon market plays a huge part of the solution. And that solution isn't just in conservation terms and nature restoration. It's really investing in renewable energy at vast scale, which is bringing down the costs of wind turbines, the cost of solar arrays, and all the technology involved with it has dropped precipitously over the past 10 years, partly as a function of scale. And so I think my counter argument would be that we really can't get there without it. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Was that Robert, you just pointing, or did you have a question?
Both, actually. One that was a really good. I mean, the presentation was fabulous, but also thank you. And I'd like to talk on, if I may, because there are a couple of things I'm involved in. Like you, I go back a long way in this field, and I know a lot of things that have worked and a lot of things that haven't, and a lot of people who are great and a lot of people who perhaps may have been discredited when they actually were doing really good work. And that last point was a case in point. But I wanted to ask another question also. And of course, there's also the New Yorker piece that we just had, which has done a somewhat similar job of sort of discrediting credits, so to speak. And I think I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But I also wanted to check something else, which is that the work you're describing in the UK is really encouraging. And as it happens, I'm working with my friend Robert Stern and See-Through Carbon and See-Through News, and he's doing some very clever use of social media to activate, as he puts it, the inactive in carbon drawdown. And one of the things that's coming up in his use, among other things, of a documentary. He used to be a documentary maker way back. He's a TV guy. One of the things he did 10 years ago was to shoot a series called Ben Law's, do you know the famous woodsman? Ben Law's Woodland Year, I think it was called. Anyway, he's doing a 10-year later update right now. And one of the things Ben is saying, this is my question to you, Richard. Ben Law, who's been a woodsman, much of his life, so you and he probably, related, same tribe. He's saying we now need to get very pragmatic and start thinking not about planting indigenous species, but different species which will survive the new circumstances, because it's very lovely to see lots of oaks and aspens going in where we used to have them once upon a time. But if they no longer can survive, given the effects of climate change that have already accrued, should we be looking at planting other species without going down the road of invasive species that can cause all sorts of unintended consequences? Have you got any thoughts on all that?
Yeah, so within the projects that we're involved with, we have forestry experts who manage the selection of the trees as an assessment of the soil type, the hydrology, the aspect, the exposure, and so on. So they'll look at a site as it is today and as it would have been, keeping in mind we're already in a warming landscape. So we're already seeing changes in the Scottish Highlands. We're seeing rivers warming so that salmon are having trouble. We might lose salmon from the UK in a generation. We're seeing areas without a hard frost, so the deer are covered in ticks. We're seeing all sorts of changes already. So it's important to consider where do we source the seeds from so they'll survive a warming climate. And that is part of the design, the project design on the front end. So it's really a balance of trees that are appropriate for that site and thinking about how the climate is going to change. When I took forestry in uni as part of my zoology degree, we talked about forests migrating between the different ice ages. You see pine forests move up and down. So in Florida, they had woolly mammoths at one point.
Yeah.
So that will have happened in the UK. We will have had forests migrate up and down the UK, with the ice ages and so on. And we have to think about that as well now. In terms of non-native species, this is kind of a hot topic. The Woodland Carbon Code itself does allow for non-native species to be within projects within a particular allotment, particular proportion. And when the Woodland Carbon Code was originally created, and that's the code that we adhere to, and that's the only official code, by the way, for these sorts of projects that's recognized by the government and the UN and so on. It allowed for more timber than it does now. So every year that they come out, they reduce the allowance for non-native species. What I've learned, because I started off being, really concerned about monoculture tree plantations going into the tropics, where essentially virgin forest was being annihilated. So I was a skeptic when it came to the timber sector, let's say. But what I've learned over time really is that the timber sector is quite important part of this picture, and it's for a few reasons. One is the UK is the world's third biggest importer of timber. At the moment, we're importing timber typically from, a lot of it's coming from virgin forest in places like Romania, the northwestern US, Canada, and so on. It's better for us from an ecological standpoint, if we look at it on a global scale, we look at biodiversity in these other places, to be growing trees here where there aren't any, than to be taking trees out of a forest, which is important, provides important habitat to a range of species somewhere else. The other part is these trees that are used in construction lock up carbon. So if you're continually planting and extracting timber, you are continually drawing carbon out of the cycle, more so than with a native forest, and at a quicker rate, because the trees grow much faster than with a strictly native forest. So in Scotland, you'll often find Douglas fir, Norwegian spruce, Sitka spruce, and so on. We are really hot and excited on the native sections of projects, but we accept that it can be helpful to have some of these areas within a project to win the landowner over, so that they will end up having a mixed nature solution where they can make some money off the timber, continue to regrow it. That helps with carbon, drawing it out of the atmosphere. And they will be putting in place nature restoration where they wouldn't have necessarily if they didn't also have the timber revenue. So we're in a transition period, really. I think in time, we'll move to even bigger native projects. That's where things are already moving. But there is an argument for fast-growing conifers. The other thing that I've learned, which really surprised me, if you go to the British Columbia in Canada, they've got Canada lynx, they've got wolves, they've got bears, they've got a diverse native habitat, which Scotland would have looked like. We would have had all these things, and they're growing in Douglas fir and Sitka spruce forests. So within timber plantations in the UK, you will find Scottish wildcats very happy within them. You'll find red squirrels, pine martens, very happy in them. You can find, for example, ospreys preferentially nesting in them over native forest because the trees are taller. So it's not all bad. And I think within the context of putting trees somewhere where there aren't any, it can have some benefit.
This is really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Nora, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much, Richard, for this fascinating presentation. It's always interesting to see how complex things are behind the scenes and all the different considerations you have to make to do the right thing. My question is, as someone who is obviously also a consumer, this like beautiful subscription that you showed, obviously, like when we see the world burn and flood and all the things, I can really see the need. Like I can feel my consumer mind being like, oh my God, yes, what a great solution. I want to have this subscription. But obviously then the flip side of it is maybe then I would take much more climate risky actions, right? Oh man, I'm paying for this subscription. What about the next flight to Spain or something? What's your thinking on that? Carbon offsets as this kind of like free for all and how we react to it psychologically and socially.
Yes, I think it's important that it's not a panacea. I mean, in our case, our family, we don't fly very often. My wife and I have family in the US, so we go there maybe every 5 years, or we should probably see them more often than we do. But we do think about reining things back, you know, but we have to be reasonable and think about what will most people be happy doing, and is it better? The airlines is an interesting one because people do, of course, travel. A lot of people, including activists, climate activists, you know, fly. And is it better not to have offsetting and to only have flight emissions, or to have offsetting in the picture? Now, the airlines are in a different market. They're in the mandatory market, so they're not in the voluntary market, particularly that I'm involved with. They're in a market with steel production and glass production and concrete and so on. So they have their own marketplace. The cost that they have in offsetting is putting real pressure on them. There's kind of a misunderstanding, an assumption that companies aren't reducing. They're massively reducing. I've got dozens of good news stories. I might give a talk on good news about what companies are doing, because there's far more happening than activists are aware of, because we're sort of all in different bubbles. And it's really exciting. So airlines are moving to sustainable liquid fuel, and they're moving to electric propulsion as well. And I think this is going to happen faster than we expect. So the short answer is, I think, you know, businesses and individuals should still think about the reductions and impacts and not just think of only buying the way out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Robert.
I don't want to take up time that someone else might want to grab. I've already asked a question or two.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I guess we were due to stop at midday, but we can go on a little bit longer, can't we? If you're happy, Richard.
Yes, if there's other questions, I'm happy to. Yeah.
You're happy with one more question?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things, talking about the good news, please, yes, please,
yes.
let's have that good news gig. Are you going to be around the Hull and Humber events going forward over the next couple of weeks? Because I'm going to be up there. Love to meet up and have a cup of tea and a chat.
Yes, let's do that. I'm giving a talk with Andrew Steele from the Plant a Tree Today Foundation. So generally on the topic of nature-based solutions. Okay. So we'll both be there for that session.
Good.
Which is on the last day of the event.
Okay. Well, if you could stick your email in the chat, that'd be handy. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
But I also wanted to ask a quick question, if I may. You know, lots of people talking of good news, and then asking, well, okay, is it entirely good news? Are looking at things like, you know, what Tony Siever's saying about precision fermentation, taking animals out of the dairy industry, for instance, and then later cellular agriculture, taking animals out of the meat industry as well. and then using land, for instance, that has been rendered no longer required for grazing dairy herds in the shorter term, to rewild and do the sort of wonderful stuff you're doing. Are you guys engaged in that? Are you happy with the way that's looking, the way it's going, or are there questions that we need to answer before we allow too much of that to happen?
Where we were involved, it tends to be in very remote places. And so you're not going to typically see large herds of cattle anywhere where we are. You'll see, so I'll give you an example. We've got a project in the middle of the Cairngorms near Aviemore, and they do have Highland cattle on that estate, but they're covering a very big area. And in fact, they let them roam semi-wild. So they let them go through the forest as well to replicate Eurasian bison, the hoof action of Eurasian bison. So none of the estates that we work with are involved with intensive meat or dairy production. So we're not really also involved with converting those lands to other use. There is something coming which is called soil carbon.
Yes.
And there's another one called blue carbon, which is to do with seaweed. Soil carbon is going to be to do with sustainable farming practices, and essentially returning the substructure of the soil to being what it would have been like before, intensive use of chemicals, and capturing carbon within that. That's something that we're going to get involved with when it's officially certified and ready for market. And so we'll have some impact in farming areas in that regard. In terms of, the meat industry generally and dairy, my wife's vegan. I eat a lot of vegan and vegetarian stuff, but not entirely. But there's certainly a big impact people can have in relation to diet in this space. There's all sorts of good information out there. You can read up on it.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm less talking about the impact of eating less meat and dairy than I'm talking about producing it without the use of livestock.
I see. Sorry, you mean producing in a lab?
Yeah, so the
yeah.
precision fermentation approach that Rethink X, Tony Siebert and his team. I don't know if you've seen a book called Brighter by Adam Dorr. He's the doctor.
I don't think so.
He's the research director at Rethink X, and they're saying, the food, energy, labor, and transport are going to be radically transformed, and the S-curve of change is already upon us. And one of the big ones in food is taking animals out of dairy initially, and then out of meat as well. By fermenting, they genetically modify the yeast, not the actual cells that are consumed by customers, and produce all the dairy. You can get better Roquefort for half the price by brewing it like you do beer in a small brewery. And then you can rewild the land where they used to graze the dairy herds. That's the idea. And I think it's got great potential, but I want to know if there's any caveats I should be aware of.
Yeah, I think as a philosophy, it's good to return more land to nature. And a lot of farms are doing that, around the fringes. And they get benefits for doing that in terms of agricultural subsidies and grants. So it's worth them doing. What we're not advocating for doing away with farming, because we take a position in relation to humans in the landscape, and then in relation to sustainable remote economies in particular. But then we are not a pressure group. We're not around in lobbying. It's just the way we go about doing the projects that we're doing. But it's fair to say that the landscape has been enormously altered, and a big part of that is farming.
Yeah.
You can't get away from that. A big part of that is when timber was extracted to build cities and cathedrals, and in the medieval period, building all the ships that we used for the British Empire, and building shoring up trenches in World War I and everything. The early the early period of metalwork, they didn't use coal at all. They just used wood because it was everywhere. So we've been consuming nature significantly for a long time.
No, it's certainly not about campaigning against agriculture the way George Monbiot does. I think it's more about, as he says, if you can get twice as good a product for half the price by fermenting it, then market forces alone will cause the phase out of dairy herds, for instance, the same way as Henry Ford caused the phase out of horse-driven transport. You know, it's just.
I think we're moving that way, aren't we?
Yeah.
You know, if you look at oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, and so on, it's the market share is growing every year, and I think people are moving into more sustainable choices. I think
there will always be some kind of caveats though to everything. Where there was a McKinsey report around the sustainable aviation fuels, which was saying they've reduced the carbon density of the fuels, but then this has been negated by a 30-odd% increase in the aviation industry. So I'm assuming that would happen with something like the meat industry as well. You know, if we definitely can free up huge tracts of land potentially through the transition of farming. However, what would that impact in terms of plastic packaging, etc., etc.? So there's always going to be kind of these caveats and knotty problems, I guess, within these. But again, I mean, I'm not anti-techno in terms of the technology going forward in the future. I just think it's we do need to kind of watch what we're doing in terms of, particularly in terms of consumption, how we're actually consuming these products and what that actually means and kind of the end impacts. So yeah, that's my reading into everything. Nora, you've got your hand up again, my lovely.
Thanks, Richard.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I was just interested in some of the challenges you're facing, especially now with this kind of more consumer-focused work. And also my second question following up from that would be, how can we help? What do you need?
Oh, bless you. There is a bit of a challenge launching something like TreeWilder. I mean, Highland Carbon, we set that up in 2017, and you know, we're supplying 60 or so company clients, including some larger clients. These are all ethical businesses who are actively reducing their footprint. So it's a real good news story. One of our clients is in the finance sector. They're reducing their footprint by 50% immediately, and they'll be down to about 75% reduction in the next 5 or 6 years. So there's massive reductions happening. So launching TreeWilder, one of the challenges I have found is to do with social media marketing. And if we boost a post on social media, even if we target it, you know, quite carefully to, you know, education level, interest in nature and science and so on, there's always climate conspiracy people who pile in, and you know that, and there's a huge amount of misinformation out there. So you know, they'll post infographics on our pages, and I'll look at them, they're completely made up, and I don't know where this all comes from, but there's a whole ecosystem out there. And there's also challenges in terms of climate activism and not liking this kind of thing. Some, you know, moderate people do, but some people are completely anti anything the businesses do and see their life as separate from the business sector, never interacting with it, when actually it's part of all our lives all the time. So one of the challenges is really amplifying good news and getting through the reflex to the most negative reactions out there. What we have stopped doing really is debating with people. There's really no point, because if you think of it's like any field you look at, there's so much information out there. If somebody's a rabid climate conspiracy theorist, or you know, they don't accept science, you know, thousands of scientists, me chiming in isn't going to change their mind. So yeah, I think that's one of the challenges, is finding the best way to amplify good news, and it's something that we're continually thinking about, and it's something we're hoping to do more of.
We'll talk about that in Hull if we get a chance, because I'm working with River Group, who are like a £47 million comms and content and social media delivery group, founded by the amazing Nicola Murphy 25 years ago. And she and I are working on that topic. So I'll chat with you. If we get a chance for a chat and a cup of tea in Hull, we'll talk about that.
That sounds great. Yeah, I look forward to that.
I expect Nora's got better ideas than me.
Yeah. Yeah, things are I mean, it's going okay. I don't want to alarm anybody. It's going okay, but there's always this in the background. There's a lot of noise.
Yeah, I guess it's hard, right? Because my assumption would be that a lot of these people just have been burned so much before, right? And I know you mentioned the Guardian article,
Yeah.
obviously that made a big splash also for me. And as someone who's not a specialist in the field, and I'm a researcher, but you can't know what's true.
Yeah.
And if you can't trust legacy media, who do you trust? So I think the systematic issue underlying this is really really profound.
Yes, I think it is, because I think if we all, as a society, are skeptical, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
I think it's about, celebrating when companies and nations do the right thing,
Mm.
because we're so busy assuming everybody's doing the wrong thing all the time. There's very little good news that gets through, when actually there's a huge amount of good news out there. So I'm going to work on that a bit more.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. And I mean, I think people want to believe, but if you've been burned 1,000 times and there's greenwashing everywhere, and you realize that the thing you bought you thought was environmentally conscious is really not all of these things, I think people just don't dare to trust anymore, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, but thank you so much. This was a fascinating project and a really fascinating talk.
It's a pleasure very much.
Brilliant. Okay, carbon also, I've seen frightening, yes, greenwashing. Yeah, we've talked about that in the thanks, Pravin. So I've just got one tiny question before we close, which was around the additional social value and capital, which is generated through the projects that you're actually working on. Are you monitoring those and evaluating that this kind of value that's added, because it's kind of immense in comparison with just the carbon actual offsets itself?
We only look at the direct impact. So the direct impact is how much money are we spending on the tree nurseries, how much money are we spending on the digger operators, and so on. What we haven't really drilled into is ecotourism. Ecotourism value, because that's longer term, it's harder to measure.
Yeah.
We don't drill into things like, how many local B&Bs and hotels and restaurants are benefiting when we bring hundreds of people into a remote part of the community for an extended period. So we don't really have the full picture. We're quite conservative about it. But I think, especially collectively, if you think about all of the organizations in this space in the UK and how much of an impact they're having, it will be enormous. And the other side of it is actually green businesses, and the impacts that they're having are extremely exciting in terms of new kinds of energy, transport, and so on. So I think parts of the country which don't really take this sector seriously are going to lose out on job creation big time when it comes to ethical businesses, climate-friendly businesses, because it's a hugely growing sector that the consumers are gravitating to. I will touch very briefly on greenwashing, just to say there's a syndrome now called green hushing. And green hushing, and I come across this a great deal, is businesses who I work with who won't communicate about what they're doing. When they're doing something good, they won't communicate about it at all, because they don't want the risk of people getting the wrong idea or piling in on it, not understanding it. Green hushing is it's quite a problem, because if companies who are doing the right thing don't talk about it, then their competitors in the sector don't think about it as much, and so on. So that's a bit of an issue. With greenwashing, I'm not in the mandatory market, so I can't really speak about that sector. But what I would say is there's a lot of misunderstanding, and one of them is that the carbon's really cheap, and companies can just buy their way out. The mandatory market, I think it's around €100 a ton. It's not cheap, and it is not cost effective for companies to buy their way out at all. And any UK company now that wants to trade in Europe is required to undertake carbon accounting and report on it, and to show how they're reducing. And that's going to become more and more the norm around the world. So I think there's a huge misunderstanding about how the market actually works. That isn't to say that it is perfect, and there are some suppliers are better than others. But it's not as bad as perhaps people might think.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you
That
all
is-
for attending.
Yeah,
My-
really, really interesting, really, really useful. So
My email address is richard@highlandcarbon.com.
I'll
If
drop you a
you'd like
line.
to follow up with me on anything, I'd be delighted to meet with any of you.
I'll drop-
Thank you.
yeah, we will be sharing the recording, and we'll have Richard's wonderful presentation as well that we can email to participants. If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'll put my email in the chat as well. We're all on the ASP website, so you can come and say hello to everybody there and contact us. And it was lovely to have you all, so thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for attending and for your questions and your time. I really appreciate it. I know everybody's busy, and for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Thank you very much.
Likewise.
Bye.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Bye.
Bye all.